The next session is privacy in the cryptocurrency, and we're starting with a very important topic. And as a law professor, I couldn't appreciate it more. Regulating decentralized systems, evidence from sanctions on Tornado Cash. This case obviously was in the news and in courts. Michael Junho of the Federal Bank of New York will be presenting.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting to present this paper. This is joint work with Anders Brownworth, Antoine Martin, and John Durfee, who is also here today. And the views expressed here are ours and not necessarily that of the New York Fed, the Federal Reserve System, or the Swiss National Bank. Okay, so decentralized systems, they're intended to be censorship resistant. And following that ethos, we've seen the ecosystem build on a decentralized network in an organization that allows for a distributed way in which decision-making and actions take place. Now, one issue is that it's also implicated at the nexus of cyber and financial crime. And this poses a dilemma for regulators. Can decentralized systems be regulated effectively? Well, in August 2022, the Treasury Department's OFAC announces a sanction on Tornado Cash. So what is Tornado Cash? Well, it's a set of smart contracts that are intended to enhance the privacy of payments on public blockchains. Now, there are two notable characteristics about Tornado Cash I'd like to highlight. First, the Tornado Cash code cannot be changed or removed. So it's already been made immutable. And this means that it's really difficult to actually operationally restrict access. Second, Tornado Cash is most popularly used on Ethereum, and settlement is distributed. And this means that in order to be effective, it requires multiple layers of cooperation. So if we think about how sanctions are actually implemented in practice, and historically, well, it relies on the rule of law, and this means using a mixture of penalties and potential enforcement actions on offenders like people, entities, and organizations. So what does regulation and cooperation look like when you're dealing with a piece of immutable software running on a global system with decentralized ownership and its distributed processes across the globe? So we're going to use and study the implications and effectiveness of OFAC sanctions to maybe shed some light on the potential limitations and strengths of trying to regulate decentralized systems by using these enforcement announcements as shocks. There's two particular announcements we have. The first one is on the actual announcement of the sanctions themselves. The second one is on a subsequent court decision that provided further clarity on the legitimacy of these sanctions. And we're going to use this to analyze the cooperative stance of the Ethereum settlement chain. So just as a preview of the results, first, many of you may know sanctions heavily impacted Tornado Cash, both in terms of the perceived value impact on Tornado Cash as a protocol and also actual usage. Second, there's actually mixed evidence on the level of cooperation and the nature of cooperation on the settlement layer. We do see the share of non-cooperative blocks or blocks including Tornado Cash transactions increase over time. We also see an increasing number of actors actually comply to the sanctions as well. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about a kind of a nuanced aspect, which is there is a fragility to the sustainability of censorship resistance that we need to think about in terms of the design and ecosystem of these decentralized systems. So I'm going to spend maybe just a moment to kind of overview some basics on Ethereum settlement and Tornado Cash, which will help us contextualize the results that we look at. So a transaction is born when a user actually submits a transaction. Now, these transactions are then submitted, and among the set of transactions that are available, a builder will select a transaction, bundle it together, and build a block. Now, once this block is built, they can offer it to validators or proposers who actually have the rights to append a new block to the blockchain. And they'll select between the different offerings of blocks by builders. And they'll push it to the nodes who then update the ledger. You can see here, this is a sense in which there are multiple layers in the settlement process or cycle in order for a transaction from start to finish to completely be settled. Okay. Now, in terms of Tornado Cash, well, there's a kind of a primitive and canonical issue with respect to privacy in the context of public blockchains. Whenever a user makes a payment, everyone can see it. Now, this may be concerning depending on your preferences or the nature of your transaction. And what Tornado Cash does, it allows users to deposit a token in the smart contract. This deposit is then pooled with another set of other deposits of same size. And the user can now withdraw this token to a new address that's not affiliated with their original address and use this in any way they want to. And so in contrast to the situation where there's a direct link between the sender and the recipient, now you sever that link. Now also the level of privacy is determined by how much pooling is available and how much you can obfuscate the payments, the relation between the sender and the actual endpoint where you actually move the deposit out. Okay. Okay, so let's start with the impact of the sanctions. And I want to start with talking about the market reaction. So Tornado Cash is run by a DAO, and the members hold a governance token called Torn. And although the governance token is not exactly an equity, it often behaves similarly and also shares certain characteristics. We're going to use this to examine what the market reaction is. Well, we see an immediate negative market reaction to the announcement. Specifically, the post-announcement price drop of the governance token is about 60%. There's two things I want to note here. First, it was a surprise. So market participants had no idea that this sanction was going to come. This is really useful because we know then all of the subsequent reaction can be attributed to the announcement itself. But secondly, in terms of magnitude, this magnitude of 60% is greater than the loss in value that the governance token had when an attacker momentarily seized complete control over the protocol in May of 2023. So this shows that this announcement itself was really viewed as an existential threat to the protocol itself. Okay. Now, what about actual usage? Well, we also see that sanctions materially lowered Tornado Cash usage as well. Post-announcement, we see about a 70% decline in both deposits or capital flowing in and withdrawals or these deposits flowing out of the Tornado Cash smart contracts across all of the pools. So here you can see the different lines indicate different size deposit pools. We also see a similar pattern in terms of a sharp decline in user diversity. And it's useful to note, though, that there are other operational factors that might have contributed to this. First, centralized exchanges started blocking transactions directly to and from Tornado Cash addresses. Secondly, some infrastructure providers cooperated with the sanctions and blocked access to popular Tornado Cash websites. This does mean that there was a diminishing level of usability of Tornado Cash, but nonetheless, it shows a remarkable decline in the throughput of deposits flowing in and out of the protocol.
What's your proxy for user diversity?
Yeah, good question. So here, one way to look at it is to look at the new set of addresses that are interacting with Tornado Cash, for example, in a weekly frequency. All right. Now, nonetheless, Tornado Cash still remains viable. Now I'll argue this because, first of all, we see that net deposits in all of the pools recover and steadily grow over time. So this means that users as a whole continue to contribute deposits and leave deposits in these pools for longer periods of time. So this indicates that there's still a level of anonymity that allows you to mask different types of transactions moving out of the smart contracts. Secondly, the fact that we observe these also means that these transactions are actually being settled. So in fact, in aggregate, the inclusion of Tornado Cash transactions in these validated blocks continues to increase over time. You can see this general upward trend. Tornado Cash transactions aren't being rejected by settlement actors at the system level. So I'm going to shed more light. One of the first takeaways is that cooperation appears to weaken down the settlement chain. We saw this picture from the users, builders, to proposers, to nodes. And we see that the level of cooperation from users is very strong. I'm going to go through kind of the cross-section of builders in a moment. But as we move down, we see that as the distance between the transaction and the agent increases, so does the level of non-cooperation we observe. Okay. Now, I want to talk, so we know that settlement itself is not a severe issue. You can still get Tornado Cash transactions on the blockchain. Let's examine the cross-section of settlement actors, though. Is this going to be useful? In particular, because Ethereum users, right after the announcement of the sanctions, legally challenged OFAC's authority to actually sanction Tornado Cash. So how should we interpret this environment? Well, there could be a perceived ambiguity with respect to the authority or the boundaries of a sanction. And this could contribute to a willingness for different types of settlement actors to continue to process Tornado Cash transactions. In other words, this also implies that if we were to see greater regulatory clarity, then we might also expect more cooperative behavior. So we're going to test this by exploiting the timing of the court decisions. In particular, in August of 2023, when courts ruled in favor of OFAC and its legitimacy on its sanctions on the smart contract. So we find actually a very stark impact in terms of the set of non-cooperative blocks when we look at it at the individual block builder level. In particular, there's a sudden large drop in the inclusion of Tornado Cash transactions by multiple large builders. In fact, when we exclude just a few builders from the set, this impact is even more pronounced. The emphasis here is on a select few. And this brings me to the second takeaway. When we drop just 2 builders from the sample, you can see that the fraction of blocks that contain Tornado Cash transactions drops precipitously. So because builders are actively selecting these transactions, what we see is that with this legal clarity, there are multiple exits to continue to support the protocol. And this means, as a result, the majority of Tornado Cash transactions in the post-court case sample is processed by a single builder. Now, this just means that if they were to exit from this activity, it would severely impair the usability of Tornado Cash. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that when we move to proposers, we actually see no switching over the entire sample in terms of their cooperative stance during our sample period. So one possible explanation is, well, proposers, they can't really see the transactions within a block. It's really hard to cooperate. So maybe it's the failure to cooperate is due to operational constraints. Well, actually, we see in sample that some proposers are able to fully cooperate over the entire sample. So this indicates that implementation is feasible. When we look into the details, actually, it's more blatant. This proposer in particular, you can see that the way in which they are non-cooperative is to accept non-cooperative blocks from a single builder. In other words, the identity of the builder is sufficient to predict whether you will receive a non-cooperative block or not. And this persistence implies that even if you cannot see or check or validate the actual transactions, you can cooperate if you really wanted to. So, well, we know that all of our systems are considering the underlying tokenomics. Maybe it's financial motives. Maybe it's the underlying incentives that drive them to do so. The short answer is no. If you look at the fees of these non-cooperative blocks relative to cooperative blocks, you actually see that they offer a discount in terms of total fees, about 15 to 20%, depending on estimations, relative to these cooperative blocks. In other words, these blocks are cheaper than the average block. So this brings me to my last takeaway. Non-cooperation does not seem to be about money. So we know that financial incentives are kind of integrated into the design in order to encourage a diverse set of views and in particular transactions to be included. And in theory, the idea is for any user who has a potentially controversial or challenging transaction to have settled, can simply increase the bounties to encourage a broad set of anonymous players to support their actions or transactions. Now, in practice, the fact that these blocks with Tornado Cash transactions are not more profitable indicates that this can't be an explanation. It's also not the operational constraints that I showed earlier. What does this leave? Well, it seems to hint that at least in the short run, it's really driven more by their ideology or philosophical reasons in order for us to understand why they continue to accept these transactions and include them into their blocks. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Alfie, we have 10 minutes.
Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. So presentation is very clear. So here's my kind of one slide summary of the paper. So the US sanctioned Tornado Cash. The value of the governance token dropped a lot. The usage dropped a lot in terms of number and volume of transactions. The user base declined, and some builders and validators subsequently then exclude Tornado Cash transactions from the blocks. And the protocol still continues to be around, though at what seems to be a slightly reduced scale. Okay, so my home country of Austria is mostly known for Mozart and pastries, and not so much known for its economic significance nor its importance for the crypto industry. So if they would impose sanctions, it would probably be totally irrelevant and nothing would happen. So contrast that with the United States, which has a much tougher law enforcement and is of great importance to the crypto economy. So in some sense, it is not too surprising that a large country like the US can make a dent into a protocol. So just for the record, that I prompted the AI for a friendly FBI agent, and this is what I got. So there might be an issue with the training sample here. Okay. So in some sense, this is a little bit what we would expect to happen here, right? And so what I want to do is to encourage the authors to look a little bit more into the data. We have a wealth of data from the blockchain to give us some more economic insights. And I think this is a great experiment that we can run and where we can learn a lot about what's going on. So one question that you could potentially ask is, has the user base changed post-sanctions? So are people that are just looking for privacy or let me try out how Tornado Cash works, have those users, are they gone, and is there now a different type of user that's remaining on the blockchain? So we could look at a couple of things. So we could look at, do these wallets interact with centralized exchanges? And if they do, are they going to Coinbase, or are they going to some, I don't know, unregulated exchange in Azerbaijan or somewhere else? How many hops away from the centralized exchange are the wallets that could give us some information about how much the users care for privacy? Are only the users that use Tornado Cash very frequently, are those the users that remain, and the infrequent users are gone? How many other mixers are users doing, or are they bridging to other blockchains to hide their trace and make it more complicated for law enforcement to track their activities? Are there wallets that are associated with exploits, other criminal activity? Are these wallets still around in Tornado Cash, or have these wallets left? So we could look at user sophistication as a measure of how many smart contracts have you interacted with in the past, and use that to see if the more sophisticated users stay or if they have left after the sanctions. I'm sure you can think of many more things, but that was one thing that came to my mind. So the other thing is to look at the users that stayed and look if their behavior has changed because of the sanctions. So are the same users now moving the money in and out more quickly? Are they remaining users interacting more frequently with Tornado Cash? What protocols are they, is the money coming from? What protocols is the money going to, and has that changed for the same users post-sanctions? So another question that comes up is that there is other mixers around, so Tornado Cash is not the only solution for this kind of privacy problem. And so have users migrated to other mixers? Has the use of other mixers increased because of these sanctions? So I think one way that regulation is limited here can also be seen that some anonymous users sent Tornado Cash, money from Tornado Cash to well-known wallets out there, and so kind of tainted wallets of other well-known users on the blockchain. So this would give you a nice example to look at the effect of being involved in Tornado Cash. Does this have any implications? So obviously somebody sent money from Tornado Cash to Buterin's wallet after that. So does that make Buterin now a criminal? Probably not, but it's interesting to see what law enforcement thinks about, and if these wallets that were tainted now with Tornado Cash, receiving Tornado Cash money, if users reacted in some way. And that could tell us something about the importance of the legal sanctions that were imposed, whether they have any grip or not. So how did those users abandon their wallets? Did any of their behavior change? And that could be an interesting control group for an analysis when we think about user behavior as a consequence of these legal repercussions here. And just have two minor comments. So one is that the paper looks at these priority fees and finds that the fees of non-cooperative blocks are lower. And I just want to make sure that this really comprises all the fees that we see. So if you go through a private mempool, very often the fee does not show up as a priority fee. It shows up as a private transfer from the user's wallet to the miner's wallet. And so the question is, are these taken into account? So to get that, you can look at the trace data of the transactions from the Ethereum node and collect the data. And so that should certainly be included, because we would expect that these a lot of these users potentially use private mempools to forward their transactions. Okay, and the last minor point is that in the paper, there's a regression of prices, and in finance, we tend to look more at returns. And so that, I think, is one recommendation that should be very easy to implement. I don't expect the findings to change because it's very obvious from the picture what's going on, but just for clarity. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We actually have a few minutes for a Q&A, about 10.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question and suggestion related to Alfred's point. So I'm curious, sorry if I missed this. I'm curious, did you look at the governance token holders? So it may be interesting to use this exogenous shock to test how governance token holders cope with the market pressure. I believe some of the governance token holders may drop the market, but I'm curious who would remain there to govern those protocols, even this protocol received lots of pressure from the regulator side.
Yes, we haven't looked in detail into the constituents of the governance token holders. I think that would be really interesting if we could see if there's a self-selection in terms of the ones that choose to remain. Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions, or maybe not even questions. First of all, Alfred was completely on point with respect to priority fees. So technically, Tornado Cash relies on the concept that you deposit funds from one address and then you use a fresh address to withdraw funds. So the fresh address usually does not have any funds, right? It cannot even pay for fees unless it receives fees from a different source. So almost by definition, right, most of the fees that are paid are via side payments, not via the priority fee. And Tornado Cash, the contract itself supports it. So that's one thing. The second thing is that you said something along the lines of proposers can use builder identities to figure out who is compliant and who is not. So even explicitly compliant builders sometimes missed some transactions. I mean, they included non-compliant transactions in their blocks in spite of them being explicitly compliant. And that's because the standard software, the standard client used to filter out non-compliant transactions, missed some of these transactions. And actually, I also attacked it in the one paper. So the thing is, proposers, instead of relying on builder identity, they rely on the relays to filter out entire blocks. Relays have a different client of their own, and they figure it out.
Okay, so those are great points. So we don't talk about the actual relays that, for example, this protocol offers in terms of providing these fresh accounts. I think of that as entirely different from potential priority fees that you might want to attach to actually process transactions. For example, even if you're making a deposit, right? So on that note, I think it's relevant, but that's the type of cost that you would still have to face even prior to creating these prior to the sanctions as well. I think there's more that we could potentially do with respect to better identifying the fees. So point well taken. In terms of the identity, the information that proposers have, in the paper, we actually go through a discussion on the relayers. It's a little bit more opaque in terms of what we can do on that front. But I will note, even for a specific set of builders, it's not hard for compliance to occur. So we're not really focused on one or two rogue blocks that enter into the picture. I think what's clear here is that there is a deliberateness to proposers wanting to support or decline Tornado Cash transactions in these blocks. I think that's the kind of the broader takeaway that I take. But thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks for the presentation. So it's not conclusive, right? Monetary versus non-monetary incentives of the builder. So just to give you one data point, so in Ethereum market structure has also been bit skewed towards the building. So for example, there are only two builders who account for 88% of block builder. So Titan and Beaver, we know. And if you know the identity here, is it like one person who's building, is it Titan or Beaver? Like that would be great. Then my second question would be more valid.
Yes, so it's Titan. Titan is the main builder.
Okay, so that's not the other smaller builder. So it's one of the big ones. Yeah. So now it becomes more complicated, right? So Titan and Beaver are building 88% of the blocks of Ethereum, right? And now that's just kind of a separating equilibrium what you are proposing. Like one is philosophically non-monetary incentivized, and one is monetary incentivized, right? It's quite a strong statement, I would say, right?
Well, so I think kind of the broader question is, if a proposer who has market power tells a builder, only send us blocks that are cooperative, that's completely feasible, right? There's no operational constraint to say, I don't want any Tornado Cash transactions. If I learn ex post, I will punish you by going to the different builders. So regardless of the builder concentration, implementation is not challenging. It's not like the identities are masked in the way that there's not communication between builders and proposers. So I think that's the first thing. But going to your point, I think there's a broader issue here with respect to the centralization, and it speaks to a potential threat to kind of being more resilient or robust to potential censorship actions. So, setting aside whether we think that these are appropriate or not, if the design ethos and the philosophy and the value comes from being censorship resistant, then there needs to be more energy devoted to trying to build a system that allows for that to be possible. And when you start to see this drift towards greater concentration, I think that's something that the system has to think about, the market participants have to think about in terms of cultivating a broader diversity of users and allowing for a more distributed system of processing.
We have time for one more question.
Hi. Yeah, I have a question. You looked also at changes of the kind of effectiveness of mixers, like following this regulatory change, because as you said before, it depends on the number of users. So I would guess that the hope for the regulators would be that the number of users goes down so much that it's not effective as a privacy tool. So do you have any comments on that?
So I think actually trying to provide an objective measure of the strength of privacy is an extremely challenging question. I have thought about it, but I think that's a really open question. I think there's some research thinking about this, but there's not really a consensus on how to do that. So I mean, that's a great point. I will say though, despite Alfred's muscular FBI agent, the OFAC sanctions do have limits, right? So there is a certain broadness, but it does have limits in terms of who it should affect. And in fact, I didn't have time to talk about it, but this is also the reason why we talk about cooperation and not compliance. Right? So you can still choose to cooperate even if the OFAC sanctions may not have direct jurisdiction over you, in anticipation that you feel like you want to cooperate and you believe in the actual actions themselves. So I think that kind of goes back to the point that the point is not to completely destroy Tornado Cash. The point is to ensure that within the reach of the sanctions, people who are affected or could follow the sanctions should behave accordingly. I think at the very least, seeing that drop in user diversity and usage kind of indicates that perhaps that was successful in terms of that. On the same vein, people can still interact with the code. They've made that statement explicitly. And one of the questions I think is, well, what is the expectation of OFAC and the Treasury Department in terms of the reach within the Ethereum settlement layer? Do they expect proposers, perhaps those that are US based, to actually be more forceful with respect to their cooperation? I think that's an open question. There's no public communication on this, but that's something that I think will be endogenously determined over time in terms of what could be done and what should be done. And thank you so much for the discussion. There's a lot of things to think about, so I very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Michael. We have another star slate of co-authors on the paper Blockchain Privacy and Regulatory Compliance. And Fabian, share, take it away.
All right, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the conference, to the organizers. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is joint work with Vitalik, Jacob, Matthias, and Ameen. And also, since I'm a technical advisor to the CPMI, the BIS, and the IMF, I also have to mention the usual disclaimer applies, so don't make them responsible for anything stupid, I might say. So I want to take a step back. I mean, in the last presentation, we more or less assumed that we want to ban privacy, and this is fine. But I want to convince you first that there are some good reasons for privacy, right? I mean, sure, there has been evidence on Tornado Cash specifically, empirical evidence that these contracts have been used by North Korean hackers. And I think it's reasonable to say that this in the end led to the sanction. But you have to understand that on public permissionless blockchains, anything you do, any transaction, any interaction is public knowledge. You can analyze that, and this is great for me as an empirical researcher, but it would be very naive to believe that we are the only ones collecting that data. And I think there are legitimate reasons, good reasons, that some form of privacy should be existing on public permissionless blockchains. So by default, as I mentioned, any information, any transaction, also any information stored on smart contracts. And the only thing that protects you from that is really pseudonyms. And this is really, really weak protection. If I interact with someone, they know my address. They can basically not only observe all of my past transactions, but also follow anything that I will do in the future by just observing my address. So clearly there is some demand for privacy. And basically what we did in this paper is we wanted to find a way, proposal that might allow you to still retain some privacy in a regulatory context. That's basically the goal. So how does it work? With Tornado Cash, basically, you have to assume that there was a transaction first. So Alice is transferring some crypto assets to Bob, let's say. And then we have exactly the problem that I've just mentioned. Alice would now be able to just follow these assets later on, observe Bob's address, and see anything else that's going on. So what could Bob do? Bob could deposit these funds into a Tornado pool, into a privacy enhancing protocol. And to be clear, anyone would still see where these assets are coming from. So this is not hidden. The deposit is clearly visible on the blockchain. And so is the withdrawal later on. But the entire idea is that when there are multiple people who are depositing into this pool, and you're breaking the link between the deposit and the withdrawal. So you can still see where the funds have been coming from. You can still see where the funds are going, but you cannot link a specific withdrawal to a specific deposit. That's the basic idea. Okay. So there are multiple ways in which you can implement this. A very naive implementation is just a centralized exchange. Many people are using centralized exchanges exactly for this purpose. They are depositing funds there, and then it's usually on some form of an omnibus account. And then later on, they use a different address to withdraw their funds, right? So you basically sever the link, as we've heard earlier, between deposit and withdrawal by using a centralized exchange. Of course, there are in the Bitcoin space things like CoinJoin. There has been Zcash, and then Tornado Cash. And you have to understand there are two conflicting goals. On the one hand, the mechanism cannot store the information that would allow anyone, any third party, to see how this deposit and this withdrawal are linked. But if you could clearly see that in the smart contract, it would defeat the purpose of this entire protocol. On the other hand, we need to ensure that only people who have previously deposited can withdraw, and ideally they can only do it once. Double spending would also not be a good idea. How can you do that? Well, using CtCe. I would just give a very brief overview because my understanding right after this session, we will have a deep dive on CtCe by someone who is much more qualified to talk about this topic than me. But what you have to understand is the idea is to basically provide proof that you have some information without revealing anything else than the fact that you know this. Okay. So what do you need? An argument of what does it stand for? Argument of knowledge. Basically, it's a person can construct a proof that demonstrate that they have knowledge of this secret value. then it has to be non-interactive. This is very important in the blockchain context, because if you have to go back and forth and basically somebody is giving you a probabilistic challenge, that would not be ideal. You simply don't have that luxury if you want to verify it in a smart contract context. And also then you could only convince one person, but you want to essentially convince the entire network, right? So it has to be non-interactive. Zero knowledge means the proof does not reveal the secret value or any other information besides the proof that the statement is true. And then the succinctness means that the proof can be efficiently verified with respect to data size, which is very important on the blockchain, and also, of course, computational runtime. There shouldn't be too many computations. Now, the way it works is you have a trusted setup, an initiation ceremony, and of course, in a decentralized setup, what you do is you just use lots of people that all provide some entropy. And the idea, the basic idea is as long as at least one person that was part of that initiation setup discards their entropy, the parameters that are being used later on for these so-called circuits will be safe. Okay, so you need at least one honest person. The circuits we will treat as black boxes. The way you can think of these is you have a prover circuit. It's basically a function where you create the proof, and then you have usually a very efficient verifier circuit that the smart contract is using to verify whether the proof under a certain set of conditions is actually valid. All right. So on a very high level, how does it work? Well, for a deposit, you have Alice. Alice essentially chooses two numbers randomly, so-called nullifier, some source of entropy. We call them K and R. They are both binary strings with a bit length of 248. And then she is creating a cryptographic representation, so-called hash value, like concatenating these two and then just computing the hash. Now, this is what we refer to as the coin ID. It's C Alice right here. And essentially what she is doing is, by depositing, by calling that function and sending, for example, 1 ETH, if that is the denomination, she's adding this to a so-called Merkle tree, right? And the entire idea is that in this Merkle tree, you have all of the coin IDs down here. With a height of 20, you can have up to approximately 1 million of these coin IDs in a given set of in a given Merkle tree. And then you represent all of these different coin IDs by just one hash value in the end, the Merkle root. Okay, so this you're hashing is pairwise, going up one step. You're hashing the other coin IDs pairwise. And then in the end, you're just ending up with one root. And this one root is representing the entire state, basically. Okay, so with the deposit, as you can see, you're basically changing this root from its initial value to a new one that includes the coin of Alice. So when you're withdrawing, what are you doing? Well, first, Alice is creating a new Ethereum address, ideally. As it turns out, many of the people who have been using Tornado Cash actually use the same address to withdraw, which defeats, I would say, the purpose of it. And then she creates something referred to as a nullifier hash, which is just a hash value of K. And she selects a recent R to construct the proof P. And this requires, and this is very important, knowledge of K and R. And this is private knowledge that only Alice has, right? So she's the only one who can create that proof, and she needs to know the leaf index I, where her coin ID is stored. So these are the parameters she's sending along, the function arguments with the withdraw function call, the address, the root she's using, the proof, and the nullifier hash. And then basically the Tornado Cash contract on chain uses the verifier circuit and does two things. Number one, it checks if P is a valid proof for the provided parameters. And second, it checks if this nullifier hash has not been previously spent. And this is the part that basically prevents double spending. Okay, that's the basic concept. That's how it works. Now, you heard all about the sanctions, so I don't think we have to revisit that. I'm happy that also Alfred talked about some of the problems with tainting. I think it's simply not a good idea, to be honest, sanctioning a smart contract, especially because you could at any point in time just redeploy the exact same set of rules at a different address. It's a little bit of a cat and mouse game, and I think it's not a very good approach. So what we have done is first, this is joint work with Matthias. We have published this paper with the Fed St. Louis. We've outlined how Tornado works, did some descriptive statistics of how it has been used, but mainly we've argued that there would have been a better reaction than just outright banning or sanctioning the contracts themselves. And this would be essentially going after the users, and when somebody is withdrawing funds from Tornado, asking for proof where this deposit has been coming from. And this is unfortunately still not very well known. This was actually implemented in the original Tornado protocol. There was a compliance tool, as they call it, in the original implementation of Tornado, where users could voluntarily disclose the link between their withdrawal and the deposit, provide a mathematical proof how these two are related. So for example, when you wanted to bring funds to a commercial bank, they could ask you, okay, we observe you have been using Tornado. Now please tell us where your withdrawal is coming from, how it is linked to a specific deposit. Now the problem is, this is great, but of course you can only use that if you're willing to disclose everything, right? So you have to disclose a one-to-one mapping from your withdrawal to your deposit. So the entire idea of this paper that I'm actually presenting today, which is joint work with the people that I've just mentioned, is to give you an opportunity to create more vague proofs. And you don't always have to go with a one-to-one mapping, but instead you can do something like, I prove that my withdrawal comes from one of these deposits right here, the blue ones, but not those, okay? So this withdrawal right here, I can mathematically prove that it comes from a subset of the set of all of the coin IDs. And we call that an association set. This could be a positive proof, could also be a negative proof. So for example, when you see that there has been a hack or some ransomware attack, as we have heard earlier, you could exclude some of these deposits, and mathematically, obviously, it's the same thing because this is also membership proof in the end. So this was quite exciting when we published that, at least to me, probably not to Vitalik. I think he's used to that. But to me, as a humble professor at the Swiss University, it was something new. We got within the first hour, we had like 250,000 views on the paper, and lots of emails, positive ones, but also, of course, very negative ones. People accusing me part of the Illuminati and stuff. So it was quite the experience. So how does it work? A little more technically, basically, this is the proof we've talked about that is also implemented on Tornado Cash, right? Where you're showing, okay, here my coin ID E is part of the root. What you do in addition is you create a custom association set. And in this association set, you would say A, B, E, F, and H are part of it. You set the rest to 0. And then you're creating an additional proof that when you're using these different leaves right here, your deposit was part of that root. Okay, so you have a second proof. How do you create these association sets? This is the hard part, and we're not tackling this in the paper, right? Because in the end, it's a legal question. It's not for us to say what specifically will be required in a given jurisdiction, but you have a lot of flexibility. So you could think of things like adding the deposits with a delay, so 7 days, and then exclude bad actors when there's some information that one of these deposits was involved in a hack. Or you could say you have some proof of personhood, some KYC, and you could say up to N amount of dollars in a given time period, it's okay, you can add that, and you will be part of the association set. Or if you're part of a community, you could think of commercial bank consortiums, risk scoring, so you have a lot of flexibility. And these things, these association sets could be provided by, for example, crypto compliance providers, commercial banks, community managers, really anyone. And of course, we hope that there will be a lot of competition. But I think one particular weakness of our proposal is that clearly there are economies of scale. And clearly we are afraid of some network effects. And one thing we want to avoid is that in the end, there is just one association set provider. This would not be a good outcome. So this is what we're slightly scared about. And we hope that there can be more research on in that regard. And one important mitigation strategy is that these proofs are public, right? Of course, you can always give stronger proofs to someone bilaterally, even a one-to-one proof. But these more vague proofs, like this one right here, ideally should be stored directly on the smart contract and so should be public knowledge for anyone to use. The last slide before I wrap up. I think in addition to just having one association set, what is important to understand, you can also prove against multiple association sets. So when you're having a transaction that goes across various jurisdictions, they might have different requirements. When you're part of various communities, they might have different requirements. And essentially what you're doing is you're just proving against the intersection of these association sets. Or you could also just create 2 of these proofs. So key takeaways, I think it's important to be aware that privacy is probably one of the biggest problems we have in the space. And we should acknowledge that. It's incredibly important that we're not just leaking all of the information in the public domain. That's not a good idea. And personally, I might be wrong about this. I don't have a legal background, but I'm not aware of any other systems, financial systems, where you have to leak all of your transactions, all of your balances, pretty much anything about you up in the open in the public. Second, I strongly encourage more interdisciplinary research on these topics. I think it's super important. That's why I also appreciate the setup of this conference, that people from various disciplines come together and work on these issues, because it's a problem that concerns legal scholars, computer scientists, but also, of course, economists. With that setup, people can prove certain claims about the origin of their funds. And the most important part, I think, is honest users can prove that they are compliant and they can dissociate themselves with activity they do not agree with. With Tornado, you didn't have that option necessarily, except if you read everything. Here, you can dissociate yourself from illicit activity, and you can thereby decrease the anonymity set of these malicious actors. Setup is very flexible, can be customized, and then last but not least, I pointed out some weaknesses of the paper. We are very open with this, and in the end, it's just should be seen as a humble contribution in the space and encourage discussion. And I hope we can have these conversations about privacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabian. Now we have 10 minutes for comments. Jiasun Lee, GMU.
Hello? Hello? Good, good. We're being interactive. Okay, I hope people can hear me. All right, great. Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank the organizer for putting up the conference and also inviting me, giving me the opportunity to read and comment on this very, very important paper. And I say this paper is important not just because it's a tradition that we say a paper is important, because I do have several, at least 3 reasons why I think that everyone here should pay attention to this paper, right? So there's no okay. All right, but anyway, so initially I was having some animation because I want to have all this, like all these figures showing up, but that's all fine. Yeah, but it's fine. There's not much loss of information anyway. So because when you convert to PDF, it just but fine. So but anyway, so why I think this, first of all, why do I think this topic is important, right? Like because actually here, like there are a lot of familiar faces, and these are a lot of pioneers and very successful people in the blockchain community, other than Galvin Belson, the other 3 people, or the other 4 people, right? And but eventually, right? So like the founder of Arthur Hayes, BitMEX, the founder of BitMEX, right? Arthur Hayes. And here is our familiar friend for Tornado Cash developer, Alexei, right? And then we have CtCe, and recently, actually, the founder of Telegram was arrested in France, right? So they all had legal troubles, right? Despite their success in the community and their major contributions to the crypto world, right? So for all of them, right, is like we know what's happening to Tornado Cash, and for Arthur Hayes and for CtCe, the charges is always about like Bank Secrecy Act and just like not complying with the government, right? And then for Durov, like for Telegram, right, there are some above ground reasons why he was arrested, but I think the rumor goes that like the government tries to look into Telegram and to find information about, especially who are, for example, like are against NATO, but like the Telegram tries to provide the users privacy, and they're not trying to budge, and then the government just take him to prison. Right? I mean, that's a rumor. I mean, I don't want to say that's necessarily the case, but that's at least what I heard. Right. So actually, also what's important, like other than the core developer, all the other people are billionaires. Right. So like if you recall from HBO show Silicon Valley when Gavin Belson talked about the situation of billionaires, and you may know what I'm actually referring to. If you have no idea what this is, then just forget about it. Right. So basically, so that actually the reason is that, especially like for us, right, as academics, okay, we think about whether the paper can get published or not. But if you are the founder, especially you're a very successful person in this community, right? So when you're not that successful yet, you think about growth, you think about ecosystem, you think about technology, and they are still important. But once you get to their level, compliance is super important, because if the other things affect your pocket, compliance will affect your freedom, right? So that's why I think there's a threat. And because of threat, there's also this opportunity, right? So like because the government cares so much about the compliance and cares so much about that, right? So there are a lot of services that actually are gaining a great market, right? We know that Chainalysis, and that's a big player, and government regulatory agencies use that a lot. It's just creating a big business. There's other competitors like Blockchain Intelligence Group, right? Also like the privacy pool that one of the author on the paper, right? Just at my university, like the Department of Homeland Security give like millions of dollars to have a center of excellence and to sponsor research in this aspect, right? I personally also benefit from that, but there's actually a lot of money there, right? So if you are not academic and you're not there yet, this is also an opportunity for us to look at, right? So I think this is another reason we should care about. And finally, right, being an academic, I think just there's science behind this. I think what is so important about this paper is that, at least to me, so far, it is really an open question and about how to reconcile between privacy preservation and regulatory compliance. As far as I know, so far, right, all the discussions is like either or. And this paper, I think, breaks the ground, right, at least to my limited knowledge, that is the first attempt to try to actually, there is a way that we can actually reconcile between these two. And the idea is also extremely natural, right? So Fabian's talk goes actually a lot of details into zero knowledge proof, but actually you don't even need to know any details about zero knowledge proof to understand the approach, right? So all you need to know is like, you can take zero knowledge as a black box, okay? Just like, okay, proving certain things without revealing anything else. So then you can just basically, the one sentence summary of the gist of this paper is that if we think about traditional privacy preserving technology like Zcash, right? What you do is that your transaction is going to be mixed with all other transactions. That would be including compliant transactions and criminal transactions. So what this paper tries to do is that, okay, well, actually we can have a more flexibility in determining what transactions your particular transaction is going to be mixed with. And if you give people the choice to mix with transactions, you can actually choose to mix with the transactions that you know that are not have criminal records, or at least you can exclude any suspicious transactions. And just take that into account, that basically you understand all the gist of the paper, right? All the other, like the details, implementation about zero knowledge, it's actually just technical details. So I think so we know that in the practical space, right, having a solution that is simple is very important for the adoption. So I think this approach also enjoyed on this benefit, right? So that for these reasons, I think this paper is important, and I think that's why everyone should pay attention to this paper. So I would like to offer a few comments, and a lot of them maybe actually just might be my confusion or just my questions on when I was reading it. And I'm sure that the authors have thought a lot about this, and maybe you already have answers, but it's just not obvious to me when I was reading the papers. I would just like to share it out with the audience, and so that we can spur some discussion. So first question is, I think actually Fabian mentioned in the talk, is that if we look at the construction, the so-called association set, just like the set that you want your transaction to be mixed with, right? So if you actually think about how it's actually constructed, the way it's constructed that all the transactions are added to a Merkle tree, and whenever there are new compliant transactions coming in, you add to this set or this Merkle tree, right? And you never actually remove transactions from this Merkle tree. Right. So it's unlike, for example, UTXOs, right? So like you are new transaction coming in, but when it's settled, and it just goes out. So this set is actually ever growing. So my question would be that what would be the size of this ever-growing association set, right? Especially if you want to apply this to Ethereum, and we know that Ethereum has this problem of state explosion, and this goes to all the discussions about like data availability stuff, right? So if we try to put this into Ethereum, and so then we will have an ever-increasing, never-decreasing set, and also like just for this solution to operate, some entities, not everyone, so which is good, but at least some entities, they need to actually keep these set forever, right? So then that seems to be potentially a re-centralization forces, right? Because there's not, over the long run, I don't think there's going to be a lot of players that can actually, a decentralized set of players that will actually be able to save this ever-growing set. And also, like the talk also mentioned, if potentially we can have multiple association sets, right? So if I take this idea to the extreme, so like just like there are, if you think about all possible association sets, that's basically the number of subsets within all transactions, and we know that's all exponential, right? So that's the size can be even larger. So I think the solution, the suggestion to the authors is that I would appreciate some reasonable quantification of the association set, right? So, and then I would dissipate some concerns over operational overhead or centralization or the trust requirement, right? So to be fair, okay, so the original design of Zcash also have the same problem. But I think maybe just for Zcash, first of all, adoption is not that high. And also most of the transaction in Zcash is actually in the transparency mode, not in the secret mode, right? So people may not feel the pain. But if the solution actually is applied to Ethereum and it's very successful, then we actually may see this problem coming up. And I think maybe people in the audience will have, or just the authors may come up with ideas about how to do that. All right, so this is my first comment. And a second comment, like here, just some quote from the paper, right? The paper says that if there is a perfect consensus on which funds are good and which are bad, then the system will lead to a simple separating equilibrium in the following sense. All users with good assets will prove membership in a good-only association set, and all the bad actors would not be able to prove that proof. So they're basically, they can perfectly separate the good guys and the bad guys. Fantastic. So as an economist, I would say I am a little bit unsure about whether a clean separation will necessarily be an equilibrium outcome. Here's my logic, right? So if bad actors, they're always singled out, right? Then if they are rational, then there should just be no reason for them to break bad in the first place, or at least they can break bad in other places, not in the Ethereum ecosystem. So if no one breaks bad, then all the costly association, the costly apparatus that we've been talking about, right, seems to be unnecessary, right? Because there's no bad guys, why do we need the police? But then the question is, if no apparatus is out there to catch those bad guys, why don't the bad guys actually rational break bad and just make Ethereum a criminal hotbed, right? So I think I think for these reasons we can see that a clean separation, at least to me, is not going to be actually necessary in equilibrium. And similar concept has been like talked about. I think many people in the audience, including myself, I have some studies on other settings. But I think this is kind of a subtle point. And also just being in the blockchain space for long enough, we understand that like the world does not necessarily operate following economist thought, right? So your outcome may still necessarily work, but just I think from a very academic perspective, right? And this may not necessarily be an equilibrium. You may need someone to be altruistic, trustworthy, or just simply irrational to make the system work. So I think this is something that's worth pointing out. And the third comment is that just I think the paper, of course, like applies to like Ethereum and talk about Tornado Cash, but at least in the paper, the way that all the discussion is motivated is using Zcash as a benchmark, right, to start all the explanation. But we know that the Zcash follows as Forkshaw Bitcoin has this UTXO model. It's simple, but Ethereum has an account model. It's not immediately obvious that just how the motivation and discussion in the paper can actually help us understand how you apply these solutions to an account-based Ethereum model. I spent some time in thinking about it. Okay, I think there's a way we can be extended, but I think especially given that we are trying to bridge different disciplines, I think for most economists, right, it may not be immediate obvious. So I think I would appreciate that the authors actually just spell it out explicitly so that it would be a more reader-friendly reading experience. I have two, how much time am I doing with time?
You're actually out of time.
I'm actually out of time. Okay, I have two minor comments and I'm gonna just leave there, and I think it's better just to leave to the floor. All right, thank you.
Thanks so much.